Chapter 69 of Lorna Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by George Fairchild. Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 69. Not to be put up with. The coat of arms, devised for me by the royal heralds, was of great size and rich colors, and full of bright imaginings. They did me the honor to consult me first, and to take no notice of my advice. For I begged that there might be a good-sized cow on it, so as to stamp our pats of butter before they went to market. Also a horse on the other side, and a flock snowed up at the bottom. But the gentlemen would not hear of this, and to find something more appropriate, they inquired strictly into the annals of our family. I told them, of course, all about King Alfred, upon which they settled that 1/4 should be 3 cakes on a bar, with a lion regardant, done upon a field of gold. Also I told them that very likely there had been a rid in the battle fought, not very far from Plover's Barrows, by the Earl of Devon against the Danes, when Hubba their chief was killed, and the sacred standard taken. As some of the Danes are said to be buried, even upon land of ours, and we call their graves, as such they be, even to this day, barrows, the heralds quite agreed with me that a rid might have been there, or thereabouts, and if he was there, he was almost certain to have done his best, being in sight of hearth and home, and it was plain that he must have had good legs to be at the same time both there and in Athelney. And good legs are an argument for good arms, and supposing a man of this sort to have done his utmost, as the manner of the rids is, it was next to certain that he himself must have captured the standard. Moreover, the name of our farm was pure proof, a plover being a wild bird, just the same as a raven is. Upon this chain of reasoning, and without any weak misgivings, they charged my growing escutcheon with a black raven on a ground of red. And the next thing which I mentioned, possessing absolute certainty, to wit, that a pig with 2 heads had been born upon our farm, not more than 200 years agone, although he died within a week. My 3rd quarter was made at once by a 2-headed boar with noble tusks, sable upon silver. All this was very fierce and fine, and so I pressed for a peaceful corner in the lower dexter, and obtained a wheat sheaf set upright, gold upon a field of green. Here I was inclined to pause and admire the effect, for even de Wishelhaus could not show a bearing so magnificent. But the herald said that it looked a mere signboard without a good motto under it, and the motto must have my name in it. They offered me first rid non ridendus, but I said, for God's sake, gentlemen, let me forget my Latin. Then they proposed rid readeth riddles, but I begged them not to set down such a lie, for no rid ever had made or made out such a thing as a riddle, since Exmoor itself began. Thirdly, they gave me rid never be ridden, and fearing to make any further objections, I let them inscribe it in bronze upon blue. The heralds thought that the king would pay for this noble achievement, but his majesty, although graciously pleased with their ingenuity, declined in the most decided manner to pay a farthing towards it. And as I had now no money left, the heralds became as blue as azure, and as red as gules, until her majesty the queen came forward very kindly, and said that if his majesty gave me a coat of arms, I was not to pay for it. Therefore she herself did so quite handsomely, and felt goodwill towards me in consequence. Now being in a hurry, so far at least as it is in my nature to hurry, to get to the end of this narrative, is it likely that I would have dwelled so long upon my coat of arms but for some good reason? And this good reason is that Lorna took the greatest pride in it, and thought, or at any rate said, that it quite threw into the shade and eclipsed all her own ancient glories. And half in fun and half in earnest, she called me Sir John so continually, that at last I was almost angry with her, until her eyes were bedewed with tears, and then I was angry with myself. Beginning to be short of money, and growing anxious about the farm, longing also to show myself and my noble escutcheon to mother, I took advantage of Lady Lorna's interest with the Queen, to obtain my acquittance and full discharge from even nominal custody. It had been intended to keep me in waiting until the return of Lord Jeffreys from that awful circuit of shambles, through which his name is still used by mothers to frighten their children into bed. And right glad was I, for even London shrank with horror at the news, to escape a man so bloodthirsty, savage, and even to his friends, among whom I was reckoned, malignant. Earl Brander was greatly pleased with me, not only for having saved his life, but for saving that which he valued more, the wealth laid by for Lord Allen. And he introduced me to many great people, who quite kindly encouraged me, and promised to help me in every way when they heard how the king had spoken. As for the furrier, he could never have enough of my society, and this worthy man, praying my commendation, demanded of me one thing only, to speak of him as I found him. As I had found him many a Sunday furbishing up old furs for new, with a glaze to conceal the moss ravages, I begged him to reconsider the point, and not to demand such accuracy. He said, well, all trades had tricks, especially the trick of business, and I must take him, if I were his true friend, according to his own description. This I was glad enough to do, because it saved so much trouble, and I had no money to spend with him. But still he requested the use of my name, and I begged him to do the best with it, as I never had kept a banker. And the John Ridd cuffs, and the Sir John mantles, and the Holly staff capes he put into his window, as the winter was coming on, and sold, for everybody was burning with gossip about me, must have made this good man's fortune, since the excess of price over value is the true test of success in life. To come away from all this stuff, which grieves a man in London, when the brisk air of the autumn cleared its way to Ludgate Hill, and clever prentices ran out and sniffed at it, and fed upon it, having little else to eat, and when the horses from the country were a goodly sight to see, with the rasp of winter bristles rising through and among the soft summer coat, and when the new straw began to come in, golden with the harvest gloss, and smelling most divinely at those strange livery stables, where the nags are put quite tail to tail, and when all the London folk themselves are asking about white frost from recollections of childhood. Then, I say, such a yearning seized me for Moray Crag, and for Dewy Blade, and even the grunting of our sheep, when the sun goes down, that nothing but the new wisps of Samson could have held me in London town. Lorna was moved with equal longing towards the country and country ways, and she spoke quite as much of the glistening dew as she did of the smell of our oven. And here let me mention, although the two are quite distinct and different, that both the dew and the bread of Exmoor may be sought, whether high or low, but never found elsewhere. The dew is so crisp and pure and pearly, and in such abundance, and the bread is so sweet, so kind and homely, you can eat a loaf and then another. Now while I was walking daily in and out great crowds of men, few of whom had any freedom from the cares of money, and many of whom were even morbid with a worse pest called politics, I could not be quit of thinking how we jostle one another. God has made the earth quite large, with a spread of land large enough for all to live on, without fighting. Also a mighty spread of water, laying hands on sand and cliff with a solemn voice in storm time, and in the gentle weather moving men to thoughts of equity. This as well is full of food, being 2/3 of the world, and reserved for devouring knowledge, by the time the sons of men have fed away the dry land. Yet before the land itself has acknowledged touch of man, upon 1 in 100 acres, and before 1 mile in 10,000 of the exhaustless ocean has ever felt the plunge of hook, or combing of the haul nets, lo, we crawl in flocks together upon the hot ground that stings us, even as the black grubs crowd upon the harried nettle. Surely we are too much given to follow the tracks of each other. However, for a moralist I never set up, and never shall, while common sense abides with me. Such a man must be very wretched in this pure dearth of morality, like a fisherman where no fish be, and most of us have enough to do to attend to our own morals. Enough that I resolved to go, and as Lorna could not come with me, it was even worse than stopping. Nearly everybody vowed that I was a great fool indeed, to neglect so rudely, which was the proper word they said, the pushing of my fortunes. But I answered that to push was rude, and I left it to people who had no room, and thought that my fortune must be heavy, if it would not move without pushing. Lorna cried when I came away, which gave me great satisfaction, and she sent a whole trunkful of things for Mother and Annie, and even Lizzie. And she seemed to think, though she said it not, that I made my own occasion for going, and might have stayed on till winter. Whereas I knew well that my mother would think, and every one on the farm the same, that here I had been in London lagging and taking my pleasure, and looking at shops upon pretence of king's business, and leaving the harvest to reap itself, not to mention the spending of money, while all the time there was nothing whatever except my own love of adventure and sport to keep me from coming home again. But I knew that my coat of arms and title would turn every bit of this grumbling into fine admiration. And so it fell out to a greater extent than even I desired, for all the parishes round about united in a sumptuous dinner at the Mother Meldrum Inn, for now that good lady was dead, and her name and face set on a signpost, to which I was invited, so that it was as good as a summons. And if my health was no better next day, it was not from want of good wishes any more than from stint of the liquor. It is needless to say that the real gentry for a long time treated my new honours with contempt and ridicule. But gradually, as they found that I was not such a fool as to claim any equality with them, but went about my farm work, and threw another man at wrestling, and touched my hat to the magistrates, just the same as ever, some gentlemen of the highest blood, of which we think a great deal more than of gold, around our neighbourhood, actually expressed a desire to make my acquaintance. And when, in a manner quite straightforward, and wholly free from bitterness, I thanked them for this, which appeared to me the highest honour yet offered me, but declined to go into their company because it would make me uncomfortable, and themselves as well, in a different way, they did what nearly all Englishmen do when a thing is right and sensible. They shook hands with me, and said that they could not deny but that there was reason in my view of the matter. And although they themselves must be the losers, which was a handsome thing to say, they would wait until I was a little older and more aware of my own value. Now this reminds me how it is that an English gentleman is so far in front of foreign noblemen and princes. I have seen at times a little both of one and of the other, and making more than due allowance for the difficulties of language, and the difference of training upon the whole, the balance is in favour of our people. And this because we have two weights, solid and, even in scale of manners, outweighing all light complacence, to wit, the inborn love of justice and the power of abiding. Yet some people may be surprised that men with any love of justice, whether inborn or otherwise, could continue to abide the arrogance and rapacity and tyranny of the Doones. For now, as the winter passed, the Doones were not keeping themselves at home, as in honour they were bound to do. 20 sheep a week, and 1 fat ox, and 2 stout red deer, for wholesome change of diet, as well as 60 bushels of flour, and 2 hogsheads and a half of cider, and 100 weight of candles, not to mention other things of almost every variety which they got by insisting upon it. Surely these might have sufficed to keep the people in their place, with no outburst of wantonness. Nevertheless, it was not so. They had made complaint about something, too much ewe mutton, I think it was, and in spite of all the pledges given, they had ridden forth and carried away 2 maidens of our neighbourhood. Now these 2 maidens were known, because they had served the beer at an alehouse, and many men who had looked at them over a pint or quart vessel, especially as they were comely girls, thought that it was very hard for them to go in that way, and perhaps themselves unwilling. And their mother, although she had taken some money, which the Doones were always full of, declared that it was a robbery, and though it increased for a while the custom, that must soon fall off again. And who would have her 2 girls now, clever as they were and good? Before we had finished meditating upon this loose outrage, for so I at least would call it, though people accustomed to the law may take a different view of it, we had news of a thing far worse, which turned the hearts of our women sick. This I will tell in most careful language, so as to give offence to none, if skill of words may help it. The following story is strictly true, and true it is that the country people rose to a man at this dastard cruelty, and did what the government failed to do. Mistress Marjorie Badcock, a healthy and upright young woman, with a good rich colour, and one of the finest hen roosts anywhere round our neighbourhood, was nursing her child about 6 of the clock, and looking out for her husband. Now this child was too old to be nursed, as everybody told her, for he could run, say 2 yards alone, and perhaps 4 or 5, by holding to handles, and he had a way of looking round and spreading his legs and laughing, with his brave little body well fetched up, after a desperate journey to the end of the table, which his mother said nothing could equal. Nevertheless, he would come to be nursed, as regular as a clock almost, and, inasmuch as he was the first, both father and mother made much of him, for God only knew whether they could ever compass such another one. Christopher Badcock was a tenant farmer in the parish of Martinhoe, renting some 50 acres of land with a right of common attached to them, and at this particular time, being now the month of February, and fine open weather, he was hard at work ploughing and preparing for spring corn. Therefore his wife was not surprised, although the dusk was falling, that Farmer Christopher should be at work in blind man's holiday, as we call it. But she was surprised, nay astonished, when by the light of the kitchen fire, brightened up for her husband, she saw 6 or 7 great armed men burst into the room upon her, and she screamed so that the maid in the back kitchen heard her, but was afraid to come to help. 2 of the strongest and fiercest men at once seized poor young Marjorie, and though she fought for her child and home, she was but an infant herself in their hands. In spite of tears and shrieks and struggles, they tore the babe from the mother's arms and cast it on the lime-ash floor. Then they bore her away to their horses, for by this time she was senseless, and telling the others to sack the house, rode off with their prize to the valley. And from the description of one of those 2, who carried off the poor woman, I knew beyond all doubt that it was Carver Doone himself. The other Doones, being left behind, and grieved perhaps in some respects, set to with a will to scour the house, and to bring away all that was good to eat. And being a little vexed herein, for the Badcocks were not a rich couple, and finding no more than bacon and eggs and cheese, and little items, and nothing to drink but water, in a word, their taste being offended, they came back to the kitchen and stamped, and there was the baby lying. By evil luck this child began to squeal about his mother, having been petted hitherto, and wont to get all he wanted by raising his voice but a little. Now the mark of the floor was upon his head, as the maid, who had stolen to look at him when the rough men were swearing upstairs, gave evidence. And she put a dishcloth under his head, and kissed him, and ran away again. Her name was Honor Josie, and she meant what was right by her master and mistress, but could not help being frightened. And many women have blamed her, as I think unduly, for her mode of forsaking baby so. If it had been her own baby, instinct rather than reason might have had the day with her. But the child, being born of her mistress, she wished him good luck, and left him as the fierce men came downstairs. And being alarmed by their power of language, because they had found no silver, she crept away in a breathless hurry, and afraid how her breath might come back to her, for oftentimes she had hiccups. While this good maid was in the oven by side of back kitchen fireplace, with a faggot of wood drawn over her, and lying so that her own heart beat worse than if she were baking, the men, as I said before, came downstairs and stamped around the baby. "Roland, is the bacon good?" one of them asked with an oath or 2. "It is too bad of Carver to go off with the only prize, and leave us in a starving cottage, and not enough to eat for 2 of us. Fetch down the staves of the rack, my boy. What was Farmer to have for supper?" "Naught but an onion or 2, and a loaf and a rasher of rusty bacon. These poor devils live so badly, they are not worth robbing." "No game? Then let us have a game of laureate with the baby. It will be the best thing that could befall a lusty infant heretic. Ride a cock-horse to Banbury Cross. Bye-bye, baby bunting. Toss him up, and let me see if my wrist be steady." The cruelty of this man is a thing it makes me sick to speak of. Enough that when the poor baby fell, without attempt at cry or scream, thinking it part of his usual play when they tossed him up to come down again, the maid in the oven of the back kitchen, not being any door between, heard them say as follows: "If any man ask us who killed thee, say 'twas the Doones of Badgery." Now I think that when we heard this story, and poor Kit Badcock came all around in a sort of half-crazed manner, not looking up at any one but dropping his eyes, and asking whether we thought he had been well treated, and seeming void of regard for life, if this were all the style of it, then having known him a lusty man, and a fine singer in an alehouse, and much inclined to lay down the law, as show a high hand about women, I really think that it moved us more than if he had gone about ranting and raving and vowing revenge upon every one. End of chapter 69. Recording by George Fairchild.
'70 of Lorna Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daisy 55. Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 70. Compelled to Volunteer. There had been much trouble in our own home during the previous autumn, while yet I was in London, for certain noted fugitives from the army of King Monmouth, which he himself had deserted in a low and curious manner, having failed to obtain free shipment from the coast near Watersmouth, had returned into the wilds of Exmoor, trusting to lurk, and be comforted among the common people. Neither were they disappointed for a certain of the time, nor in the end was their disappointment caused by fault on our part. Major Wade was one of them, an active and well-meaning man, but prone to fail in courage, upon lasting trial, although in a moment ready. Squire John Witchhazel, not the Baron, and Parson Powell, note, not our Parson Bowden, nor any more a friend of his. Our Parson Bowden never had naught whatever to do with it, and never smoked a pipe with Parson Powell after it. J.R. caught him 2 or 3 months before my return, in Farley farmhouse near Bredon. He had been up at our house several times, and Lizzie thought a great deal of him. And well I know that if at all that time I had been in their neighbourhood, he should not have been taken so easily. John Birch, the farmer who had sheltered him, was so fearful of punishment that he hanged himself in a few days' time, and even before he was apprehended. But nothing was done to Gracie Howell, of Bridgeball, who had been Wade's greatest comforter. Neither was anything done to us, although Eliza had added greatly to mother's alarm and danger by falling upon Rector Powell, and most soundly rating him for his meanness, and his cruelty and cowardice, as she called it, in setting men with firearms upon a poor helpless fugitive, and robbing all our neighbourhood of its fame for hospitality. However, by means of Sergeant Boxham and his good report to us, as well as by virtue of Wade's confession, which proved of use to the government, my mother escaped all penalties. It is likely enough that good folk will think it hard upon our neighbourhood to be threatened, and sometimes heavily punished, for kindness and humanity, and yet to be left to help ourselves against tyranny and base rapine. And now at last our gorge was risen, and our hearts in tumult. We have bore our troubles long, as a wise and wholesome chastisement, quite content to have some few things of our own unmeddled with. But what could a man dare to call his own, or what right could he have to wish for it, while he left his wife and children at the pleasure of any stranger? The people came flocking all around me, at the blacksmith's forge, in the Bredon's alehouse, and I could scarcely come out of church, but they got me among the tombstones. They all agreed that I was bound to take the command and management. I bade them to go to the magistrates, but they said they had been too often. Then I told them that I had no wits for ordering of an armament, although I could find fault enough with one which had not succeeded. But they would hearken to none of this. All they said was, "Try to lead us, and we will try not to run away." This seemed to me to be common sense and good stuff, instead of mere bragging. Moreover, I myself was moved by the bitter wrongs of Margery, having known her at the Sunday school, ere ever I went to Tiverton, and having in those days serious thoughts of making her my sweetheart, although she was 3 years my elder. But now I felt this difficulty. The Doones had behaved very well to our farm, and to mother, and all of us, while I was away in London. Therefore it would not be shabby and mean for me to attack them now. Yet being pressed still harder and harder, as day by day the excitement grew, with more and more talking over it, and no one else coming forward to undertake the business, I agreed at last to this, that if the Doones, upon fair challenge, would not endeavour to make amends by giving up Mistress Margery, as well as the man who had slain the baby, then I would lead the expedition, and do my best to subdue them. All our men were content with this, being thoroughly well assured from experience, that the haughty robbers would only shoot any man who durst approach them with such proposal. And then arose a difficult question. Who was to take the risk of making overtures so unpleasant? I waited for the rest to offer, and as none was ready, the burden fell on me, and seemed to be of my own inviting. Hence I undertook the task, sooner than reason about it, for to give the cause of everything is worse than to go through with it. It may have been 3 of the afternoon, when leaving my witnesses behind, for they prefer the background, I appeared without Lizzie's white handkerchief upon a kidney bean stick at the entrance to the robber's dwelling, scarcely knowing what might come of it. I had taken the wise precaution of fastening a Bible over my heart, and another across my spinal column, in case of having to run away, with rude men shooting at me. For my mother said that the word of God would stop a 2-inch bullet, with 3 ounces of powder behind it. Now I took no weapons, save those of the Spirit, for fear of being misunderstood; but I could not bring myself to think that any of honourable birth would take advantage of an unarmed man coming in guise of peace to them. And this conclusion of mine held good, at least for a certain length of time, inasmuch as 2 decent Doones appeared, and hearing of my purpose, offered, without violence, to go and fetch the captain, if I would stop where I was, and not being to spy about anything. To this of course I agreed at once, for I wanted no more spying, because I had thoroughly knowledge of all ins and outs already. Therefore I stood waiting steadily, with one hand in my pocket feeling a sample of corn for market, and the other against the rock, while I wondered to see if it so brown already. Those men came back in a little while, with a sharp short message that Captain Carver would come out and speak to me by and by, when his pipe was finished. Accordingly I waited long, and we talked about the signs of bloom for the coming apple season, and the rain that had fallen last Wednesday night, and the principal dearth of Devonshire, that it will not grow many cowslips, which we were quite agreed to be the prettiest of spring flowers; and all the time I was wondering how many black and deadly deeds these 2 young innocent youths had committed, ever since last Christmas. At length a heavy and haughty step sounded along the stone roof of the way, and then the great Carver Doone drew up, and looked at me rather scornfully, not with any spoken scorn, nor flash of strong contumely, but with that air of thinking little, and praying not to be troubled, which always vexes a man who feels that he ought not to be despised so, and yet knows not how to help it. "What is it you want, young man?" he asked, as if he had never seen me before. In spite of that strong loathing which I always felt at sight of him, I commanded my temper moderately, and told him that I was come for his good, and that of his worshipful company, far more than my own; that a general feeling of indignation had arisen among us at the recent behaviour of certain young men, for which he might not be answerable, and for which he would not condemn him, without knowing the rights of the question; but I begged him clearly to understand that a vile and inhuman wrong had been done, and such as we could not put up with it; but that if he would make what amends he could by restoring the poor woman, and giving up that odious brute who had slain the harmless infant, we would take no further motion, and things should go on as usual. As I put this in the fewest words that would meet my purpose, I was grieved to see a disdainful smile spread on his sallow countenance. Then he made me a bow of mock courtesy, and replied as follows: "Sir John, your new honours have turned your poor head, as might have been expected. We are not in the habit of deserting anything that belongs to us, far less our sacred relatives. This insolence of your demand well nigh outdoes the ingratitude. If there be a man upon Exmoor who has grossly ill-used us, kidnapped our young woman, and slain half a dozen of our young men, you are that outrageous rude Sir John. And after all this, how have we behaved? We have laid no hand upon your farm. We have not carried off your woman. We have not even allowed you to take our queen, by creeping and crawling treachery. And we have given you leave of absence, to help your cousin the highwayman, and to come home with a title. And now, how do you requite us? By inflaming a boyish indignation at a little frolic of our young men, and by coming with some insolent demands, to yield to which would ruin us. Oh, you ungrateful viper!" As he turned away in sorrow from me, shaking his head at my badness, I became so overcome, never having quite been assured even by people's praises about my own goodness. Moreover, the light which he threw upon things different so greatly from my own, that, in a word, not to be too long, I feel that I was a villain, and with many bitter pangs, for I have bad things to repent of, I began in my leisure to ask myself whether or not this bill of indictment against John Ridd was true. Some of it I knew to be, however much I condemned myself, altogether out of reason. For instance, about my going away with Lorna very quietly over the snow, and to save my love from being starved away from me. In this there was no creeping, neither crawling treachery, for all was done with siding. And yet I was so out of training for being charged by other people beyond mine own conscience, that Carver Doone's harsh words came on me like prickly spinach sowed with raking. Therefore I replied and said, "It is true that I owe you gratitude, sir, for a certain time of forbearance, and it is to prove my gratitude that I am come here now. I do not think that my evil deeds can be set against your own. Although I cannot speak flowingly upon my good deeds as you can, I took your queen because you starved her, having stolen her long before, and killed her mother and brother. This is not for me to dwell upon now. Any more I would say much about your murdering of my father. But how the balance hangs between us, God knows better than thou or I, thou low miscreant Carver Doone." I had worked myself up, as I always do, in the manner of heavy men, growing hot like an ill-washed wheel revolving, though I start with a cool axle, and I felt ashamed of myself for heat, and ready to ask pardon. But Carver Doone regarded me with a noble and fearless grandeur. "I have given thee thy choice, John Ridd," he said in a lofty manner, which made me drop away under him. "I always wish to do my best with the worst people who come near me, and of all I have ever met with thou art the very worst, Sir John, and the most dishonest. Now, after all my labouring to pay every man to a penny, and to allow the woman over, when among the crouched grass, which is a sad thing for the grounds, to be charged like this, I say, so amazed me that I stood, with my legs quite open, and ready for an earthquake. And the scornful way in which Sir John went to my very heart, nay, rather the chance of mischief. I did my best to look calmly at him, and to say with a quiet voice, 'Farewell, Carver Doone. This time our day of reckoning is nigh.' 'Thou fool, it is come,' he cried, leaping aside with a niche of rock by the doorway. 'Fire!' Save for the quickness of spring and readiness, learned in many a wrestling bout, that cavish trick must have ended me, but scarce was the word fire out of his mouth ere I was out of fire by a single bound behind the rocky pillar of the opening. In this jump I was so brisk at impulse of the love of life, for I saw the muzzle set upon me from the darkness of the cavern, that the men who had trained their guns upon me with good will and daintiness could not check their fingers crooked upon the heavy triggers, and the volley sang with a roar behind it down the avenue of crags. With one thing and another, and most of all the treachery of this dastard scheme, I was so amazed that I turned and ran, at the very top of my speed, away from these vile fellows, and luckily for me, they had not another charge to send after me, and thus by good fortune I escaped, but with a bitter heart, and mine at that treacherous Upsich. Without any further hesitation, I agreed to take command of the honest men who were burning to punish, ay, and destroy, those outlaws, as now beyond bearing. One condition, however, I made, namely, that the counsellor should be spared if possible, not because he was less a villain than any of the others, but that he seemed less violent, and above all had been good to Annie; and I found hard work to make them listen to my wish upon this point. For all the Doones, Sir Counsellor had made himself most hated by his love of law and reasoning. We arranged that all our men should come and fall into order with pike and musket, over against our dung hill; and we settled early in the day that their wives might come and look at them; for most of these men had good wives, quite different from sweethearts, such as the militia had; women indeed who could hold to a man, and see to him, and bury him, if his luck were evil, and perhaps have no one afterwards. And all these women pressed their rights upon their precious husbands, and brought so many children with them, and made such a fuss, and hugging, and racing after little legs, that our farmyard might have been taken for an outdoor school for babies, rather than a review ground. I myself was to and fro among the children continually; for if I love anything in the world, foremost I love children. They warm, and yet they cool our hearts, as we think of what they were, and what in young clothes we hope to be, and how many things have come across; and to see our motives moving in the little things that know not what their aim or object is, must almost, or ought at least, to lead us home and soften us. For neither end of life is home, both source and issue being God. Nevertheless, I must confess that the children were a plague sometimes. They never could have enough of me, being 100 to 1, you might say; but I had more than enough of them, and yet was not contented; for they had so many ways of talking, and of tugging at my hair, and of sitting upon my neck, not even two with their legs alike; and they forced me to jump so vehemently, seeming to court the peril of my coming down neck and crop with them, and urging me still to go faster, however fast I might go with them. I assure you that they were sometimes so hard and tyrannical over me, that I might almost as well have been among the very Doones themselves. Nevertheless, the way in which the children made me useful proved also of some use to me; for their mothers were so pleased by the exertions of the great Gigi, as all the small ones entitled me, that they gave me unlimited power and authority over their husbands. Moreover, they did their utmost among their relatives round about to fetch recruits for our little band; and by such means several of the yeomanry from Barnstaple and from Tiverton were added to our number; and inasmuch as these were armed with heavy swords and short carbines, their appearance was truly formidable. Tom Faggus also joined us heartily, being now quite healed of his wound, except at times when the wind was easterly. He was made second in command to me, and I would gladly have had him first, as more fertile in expedients; but he declined such rank on the plea that I knew most of the seat of war, besides that I might be held in some measure to draw authority from the King. Also Uncle Ben came over to help us, with his advice and presence, as well as with a band of stout warehousemen whom he brought from Dulverton; for he had never forgiven the old outrage put upon him; and though it had been to his interest to keep quiet during the last attack, under Commander Stickles, for the sake of his secret gold mine, yet now he was in a position to give full vent to his feelings. For he and his partners, when fully assured of the value of their diggings, had obtained from the Crown a license to adventure in search of minerals, by payment of a heavy fine and a yearly royalty. Therefore they had now no longer any cause for secrecy, neither for dread of the outlaws, having so added to their force as to be a match for them. And although Uncle Ben was not the man to keep his miners idle an hour more than might be helped, he promised that when we had fixed the moment for an assault on the valley, a score of them should come to aid us, headed by Simon Carfax, and armed with the guns which they always kept for the protection of their gold. Now whether it was Uncle Ben, or whether it was Tom Faggus, or even my own self, for all three of us claimed the sole honour, is more than I think fair to settle without allowing them a voice. But at any rate, a clever thing was devised among us, and perhaps it would be the fairest thing to say that this bright stagman, worthy of the great Duke himself, was contributed, little by little, among the entire three of us, all having pipes and snaps and water, in the chimney corner. However, the world, which always judges according to reputation, vowed that so fine a stroke of war could only come from a highwayman, and so Tom Faggus got all the honour, at least perhaps then a third of the cost. Not to attempt to rob him of it, for robbers, more than any other, contend for rights of property, let me try to describe this grand artifice. It was known that the Doones were fond of money, as well as strong drink and other things, and more especially fond of gold, when they could get it pure and fine. Therefore it was agreed that in this way we should tempt them, for we knew that they looked with ridicule upon our rustic preparations. After repulsing king's troopers and the militia of two countries, was it likely that they should yield their fortress to a set of ploughboys? We, for our part, felt, of course, the power of this reasoning, and that where regular troops had failed, half-armed countrymen must fail, except by superior judgment and harmony of action. Though perhaps the militia would have sufficed, if they had only fought against the foe, instead of against each other. From these things we took warning. Having failed through overconfidence, was it not possible now to make the enemy fail through the same self-cause? Hence, what we devised was this: to delude from home a part of the robbers, and by fall surprise on the other part. We caused it to be spread abroad that a large heap of gold was now collected at the mine of the Wizard's Slough. And when this rumour must have reached them, through women who came to and fro, as some entirely faithful to them were allowed to do, we sent Captain Simon Carfax, the father of little Guinea, to demand an interview with the Counsellor, by night, and as it was secretly. Then he was to set forth a list of imaginary grievances against the owners of the mine, and to offer partly through resentment, partly through the hope of gain, to betray into their hands, upon the Friday night, by far the greatest weight of gold as yet sent up for refining. He was to have 1/4 part, and they to take the residue; but inasmuch as the convoy across the moors, under his command, would be strong and strongly armed, the Doones must be sure to send not less than a score of men, if possible. He himself, at a place agreed upon, and fit for an ambuscade, would call a halt, and contrive, in the darkness, to pour a little water into the priming of his company's guns. It cost us some trouble, and a great deal of money, to bring the sturdy Cornishman into the deceitful part; and perhaps he never would have consented but for his obligation to me, and the wrongs, as he said, of his daughter. However, as he was the man for the task, both from his coolness and courage, and being known to have charge of the mine, I pressed him, until he undertook to tell all the lies we required; and right well he did it too, having once made up his mind to it, and perceiving that his own interests called for the total destruction of the robbers. End of chapter 70. Recording by Daisy 55. Chapter 71 of Lorna Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daisy 55. Lorna Doone by Aura D. Blackmore. Chapter 71. A Long Account Settled. Having resolved on a night assault, or as our undisciplined men, 3/4 of whom had never been shot at, could not fairly be expected to march up to visible musket mouths, we cared not much about drilling our forces, only to teach them to hold a musket so far as we could supply that weapon to those with the cleverest eyes, and to give them familiarity with the noise it made in exploding. And we fixed upon Friday night for our venture, because the moon would be at the full, and our powder was coming from Dulverton on the Friday afternoon. Uncle Reuben did not mean to expose himself to shooting, his time of life for risk of life being now well over, and the residue too valuable. But his counsels and his influence, and above all his warehousemen, well practised in beating carpets, were of true service to us. His miners also did great wonders, having a grudge against the Doones, as indeed who had not for 30 miles round their valley. It was settled that the yeomen, having good horses under them, should give account, with the miners' help, of as many Doones as might be dispatched to plunder the pretended gold. And as soon as we knew that this party of robbers, be it more or less, was out of hearing from the valley, we were to fall to ostensibly at the Doone gate, which was impregnable now, but in reality upon their rear, by means of my old water slide. For I had chosen 20 young fellows, partly miners, partly warehousemen, and sheep farmers, and some of other vocations, but all had to be relied upon for spirit and power of climbing, and with proper tools to aid us, and myself to lead the way, I felt no doubt whatever but that we could all attain the crest where first I met with Lorna. Upon the whole, I rejoiced that Lorna was not present now. It must have been irksome to her feelings to have all her kindred and old associates, much as she kept aloof from them, put to death without ceremony, or else putting us all to death. For all of us were resolved this time to have no more shilly-shallying, but to go through with a nasty business, in the style of honest Englishmen, when the question comes to your life or mine. There was hardly a man among us who had not suffered bitterly from the miscreants now before us. One had lost his wife perhaps, another had lost a daughter, according to their ages, another had lost his favourite cow. In a word, there was scarcely any one who had not to complain of a hayrick, and what surprised me then, not now, was that the men least injured made the greatest push concerning it. But be the wrong too great to speak of, or too small to sweat about, from poor Kit Babcock to rich Master Huckaback, there was not one but went heart and soul for stamping out these firebrands. The moon was lifting well above the shoulder of the uplands, when we, the chosen band, set forth, having the short cut along the valleys to foot of the Bagworthy water, and therefore having allowed the rest an hour, to fetch round the moors and hills. We were not to begin our climb until we heard a musket fire from the heights on the left hand side, where John Fry himself was stationed, upon his own and his wife's request, so as to keep out of action. And that was the place where I had been used to sit, and to watch for Lorna. And John Fry was to fire his gun, with a ball of wood inside it, so soon he had heard the hurly-burly at the Doone gate beginning, which we, by reason of waterfall, could not hear down in the meadows there. We waited a very long time, with the moon marching up heaven steadfastly, and the white fog trembling in chords and columns like a silver harp of the meadows. And then the moon drew up the fogs, and scarfed herself in white with them, and so being proud, gleamed upon the water like a bride at her looking glass, and yet there was no sound of either John Fry or his blunderbuss. I began to think that the worthy John, being out of all danger, and having brought a counterpane, according to his wife's directions, because one of the children had a cold, must veritably have gone to sleep, leaving other people to kill or to be killed, as might be the will of God, so that he were comfortable. But herein I did wrong to John, and am ready to acknowledge it. For suddenly the most awful noise that anything short of thunder could make, came down among the rocks, and went and hung upon the corners. "The signals, my lad!" I cried, leaping up and rubbing my eyes; for even now, while condemning John unjustly, I was giving him right to be hard upon me. "Now hold on by the rope, and lay your quarterstaffs across, my lads, and keep your guns pointing to heaven, lest haply we shoot one another." "Us shan't never shoot one another with a goons at that mark, I reckon," said an oldish chap, but as tough as leather, and esteemed a wit for his dryness. "You come next to me, old Ike. You be enough to draw up the waters now, remember. All lean well forward. If any man throws his weight back, down he goes, and perhaps he may never get up again, and most likely he will shoot himself." I was still more afraid of their shooting me, for my chief alarm in this steep ascent was neither of the water nor of the rocks, but of the loaded guns we bore. If any man slipped, off might go his gun, and however good his meaning, I being first was most likely to take far more than I fain would apprehend. For this cause I had debated with Uncle Ben and with Cousin Tom as to the expediency of our climbing with guns unloaded. But they, not being in the way themselves, assured me that there was nothing to fear, except through uncommon clumsiness, and that as for charging our guns at the top, even veteran troops could scarcely be trusted to perform it properly in the hurry, and the darkness, and the noise of fighting before them. However, thank God, though a gun went off, no one was any worse for it, neither did the Doones notice it, in the thick of the firing in front of them. For the orders to those of the sham attack, conducted by Tom Faggus, were to make the greatest possible noise without exposure to themselves, until we in the rear had fallen to, which John Fry was again to give the signal of. Therefore we, of the chosen band, stole up the meadow quietly, keeping in the blots of shade and hollow of the watercress. And the earliest notice the counsellor had, or any one else, of our presence, was the blazing of the log wood house, where lived that villain Carver. It was my especial privilege to set his house on fire, upon which I had insisted exclusively and conclusively. No other hand but mine should lay a brand, or strike steel on flint for it. I had made all preparations carefully for a godly blaze, and I must confess that I rubbed my hands with a strong delight and comfort, when I saw the home of that man who had fired so many houses, having its turn of smoke and blaze and of crackling fury. We took good care, however, to burn no innocent children or woman in that most righteous destruction, for we brought them all out beforehand. Some were glad, and some were sorry, according to their dispositions. For Carver had 10 or a dozen wives, and perhaps that had something to do with his taking the loss of Lorna so easily. One child I noticed, as I saved him, a fair and handsome little fellow, whom, if Carver Doone could love anything on earth besides his wretched self, he did love. The boy climbed on my back and rode, and much as I hated his father, it was not in my heart to say or do a thing to vex him. Leaving these poor injured people to behold their burning home, we drew aside, by my directions, into the covert beneath the cliff, but not before we had laid our brands to 3 other houses. After calling the women forth, and bidding them to go for their husbands, and to come and fight 100 of us. In the smoke and rush and fire they believed that we were 100, and away they ran, in consternation, to the battle at the Doone gate. "All Doone town is on fire, on fire!" we heard them shrieking as they went. 100 soldiers are burning it, with a dreadful great man at the head of them. Presently, just as I expected, back came the warriors of the Doones, leaving but 2 or 3 at the gate, and burning with wrath to crush underfoot the presumptuous clowns in their valley. Just then the waxen fire leaped above the red crest of the cliffs, and danced on the pillars of the forest, and lapped like a tide on the stones of the slope. All the valley flowed with light, and the limped waters reddened, and the fair young woman shone, and the naked children glistened. But the finest sight of all was to see those haughty men striding down the causeway darkly, reckless of their end, but resolved to have 2 lives for every one. A finer dozen of young men could not have been found in the world perhaps, nor a braver, nor a viler one. Seeing how few there were of them, I was very loth to fire, although I covered the leader, who appeared to be Dashing Charlie, for they were at easy distance now, brightly shone by the firelight, yet ignorant where to look for us. I thought that we might take them prisoners, though what good could that be, God knows, as they must have been hanged thereafter. Anyhow, I was loath to shoot, or to give the word to my followers. But my followers waited for no word. They saw a fair shot at the men they abhorred, the men who had robbed them of home or of love, and the chance was too much for their charity. At a signal from old Ikey, who levelled his own gun first, a dozen muskets were discharged, and half of the Doones dropped lifeless, like so many logs of fire or chopping blocks rolled over. Although I had seen a great battle before, and 100 times the carnage, this appeared to me to be horrible, and I was at first inclined to fall upon our men for behaving so. But one instant showed me that they were right. For while the valleys were filled with howling, and with shrieks of women, and the beams of the blazing houses fell, and hissed in the bubbling water, all the rest of the Doones leaped at us, like so many demons. They fired wildly, not seeing us well among the haze, bushes, and then they clubbed their muskets, or drew their swords, as might be, and furiously drove at us. For a moment, although we were twice their number, we fell back before their valorous fame, and the power of their onset. For my part, admiring their courage greatly, and counting on its slur upon manliness that 2 should be down upon one so, I withheld my hand awhile, for I cared to meet none but Carver, and he was not among them. The whirl and hurry of this fight, and the hard blows raining down, for now all guns were empty, took away my power of seeing, or reasoning upon anything. Yet one thing I saw, which dwelled long in me, and that was Christopher Babcock speeding his life to get Charlie's. How he had found out, none may tell, both being dead so long ago. But at any rate, he had found out that Charlie was the man who had robbed him of his wife and honour. It was Carver Doone who took her away. But Charlie Worth Doone was beside him, and according to cast the dice, she fell to Charlie's snare. All this Kit Babcock, who was mad, according to our measures, had discovered and treasured up, and now was his revenge time. He had come into the conflict without a weapon of any kind, only begging me to let him be in the very thick of it. For him, he said, life was no matter after the loss of his wife and child, but death was matter to him, and he meant to make the most of it. Such a face I never saw, and never hope to see again, as when poor Kit Babcock spied Charley coming towards us. We had thought this man a patient fool, a philosopher of a little sort, or one who could feel nothing, in his quiet manner of going about, and the gentleness of his answers, when some brutes asked him where his wife was, and whether his baby had been well trussed. These had misled us to think that the man would turn the mild cheek to everything. But I, in the loneliness of our barn, had listened, and had wept with him. Therefore was I not surprised, so much as all the rest of us, when in the foremost of red light, Kit went up to Carver Doone, as if to some inheritance, and took his citizen of right upon him, being himself a powerful man, and begged a word aside with him. What they had said aside, I not know. All I know is that without weapon, each man killed the other. And Margery Babcock came, and wept, and hung upon her poor husband, and died, that summer, of heart disease. Now for these and other things, whereof I could tell 1,000, was the reckoning come that night, and not a line we missed of it. Soon as our bad blood was up, I like not to tell of slaughter, though it might be of wolves and tiger, and that was a night of fire and slaughter, and of a very long harbored revenge. Enough that ere the daylight broke upon that wan March morning, the only Doones still left alive were the Counsellor and Carver. And of all the dwellings of the Doones, inhabited with luxury, and luscious taste, and licentious, not even one was left, but all made potash in the river. This may seem a violent and unholy revenge upon them, and I, who led the heart of it, have in these my latter years doubted how I shall be judged, not of men, for God only knows the errors of man's judgments, but by that great God himself, the front of whose forehead is mercy. End of chapter 71. Recording by Daisy 55. 22 of Lorna Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daisy 55. Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 72. The Counsellor and the Carver. From that great confusion, for nothing can be broken up, whether lawful or unlawful, without a vast amount of dust, and many people grumbling, and mourning for the good old times, when all the world was happiness, and every man a gentleman, and the sun himself far brighter than since the brassy idol upon which he shone was broken. From all this loss of ancient landmarks, as unrobbed men begin to call our clearance of those murderers, we returned on the following day, almost as full of anxiety as we were of triumph. In the first place, what could we possibly do with all these women and children, thrown on our hands, as one might say, with none to protect them and care for them? Again, how should we answer to the justices of the peace, or perhaps even to Lord Jeffreys, for having, without even a warrant, taken the law into our own hands, and abated our nuisance for so forcibly? And then, what was to be done with the spoil, which was of great value, though the diamond necklace came not to public light? For we saw a mighty host of claimants already leaping up for booty. Every man who had ever been robbed expected usury on his loss. The lords of the manors demanded the whole, and so did the King's Commissioner of Revenue at Porlock, and so did the men who had fought our battle, while even the parsons, both Bowden and Powell, and another who had no parish in it, threatened us with the just wrath of the church, unless each had tithes of the whole of it. Now this was not as it ought to be, and it seemed as if by the burning nest of robbers we had but hatched their eggs, until being made sole guardian of the captured treasure, by reason of my known honesty, I hit upon a plan, which gave very little satisfaction, yet carried this advantage, that the grumblers argued against one another, and for the most part came to blows, which renewed their good will to me, as being abused by the adversary. And my plan was no more than this: not to pay a farthing to lord of manor, parson, or even king's commissioner, but after making good some of the recent and proven losses, where the men could not afford to lose, to pay the residue, which might be worth some £50,000, into the exchequer at Westminster, and then let all the claimants file what wills they pleased in Chancery. Now this was a very noble device, for the mere name of Chancery, and the high repute of the fees therein, and low repute of the lawyers, and the comfortable knowledge that the wool sack itself is the golden fleece, absorbing gold for ever, if the standard be but pure, consideration of these things staved off at once the lords of the manors, and all the little farmers, and even those whom most I feared, viz. the parsons. And the king's commissioner was compelled to profess himself contented, although of all he was most aggrieved, for his pickings would have been godly. Moreover, by this plan I made, although I never thought of that, a mighty friend worth all the enemies, whom the loss of money moved. The first man now in the kingdom, by virtue perhaps of energy, rather than of excellence, was the great Lord Jeffreys, appointed the head of the equity, as well as the law of the realm, for his kindness in hanging 500 people without the mere brief of trial. 9 out of 10 of these people were innocent, it was true, but that proved the merit of the Lord Chief Justice so much the greater for hanging them, as showing what might be expected of him, when he truly got hold of a guilty man. Now the king had been the force of this argument, and not being without gratitude for a high seasoned dish of cruelty, had prompted the only man in England, combining the gifts of both butcher and cook. Nevertheless, I do beg you all to believe me, and I think that, after following me so long, you must believe it, that I did not even know at the time of Lord Jeffreys' high promotion. Not that my knowledge of this would have led me to act otherwise in the matter, for my object was to pay into an office, and not to any official. Neither, if I had known the fact, could I have seen its bearing upon the receipt of my money, for the king's exchequer is, meseemeth, of the common law, while Chancery is of equity, and well named for its many chances. But the true result of the thing was this: Lord Jeffreys, being now head of the law, and almost head of the kingdom, got possession of that money, and was kindly pleased with it. And this met our second difficulty, for the law having won, and laughed over the spoil, must have injured its own tithe by impugning our legality. Next, with regard to the women and children, we were long in a state of perplexity. We did our very best at the farm, and so did many others to provide for them, until they should manage about their own substance. And after a while this trouble went, as nearly all troubles go with trying. Some of the women were taken back by their parents, or their husbands, or may be their sweethearts, and those who failed of this went forth, some upon their own account to the New World plantations, where the fairer sex is valuable, and some to English cities, and the plainer ones to field work. And most of the children went with their mothers, or were bound apprentices. Only Carver Doone's handsome child had lost his mother, and stayed with me. This boy went about with me everywhere. He had taken as much of liking to me, first showing in his eyes by the firelight, as his father had of hated. And I, perceiving his noble courage, scorn of lies, and high spirit, became almost as fond of Ensor as he was of me. He told us that his name was Ensor, meant for Ensor, I suppose, from his father's grandfather, the old Sir Ensor Doone, and this boy appeared to be Carver's heir, having been born in wedlock, contrary to the general manner and custom of the Doones. However, although I loved the poor child, I could not help feeling very uneasy about the escape of his father, the savage and brutal Carver. This man was left to roam the country, homeless, fatherless, and desperate, with his giant strength and great skill in arms, and the whole world to be revenged upon. For his escape the manners, as I shall show, were unanswerable. But of the counsellor's safe departure the burden lay on myself alone, and inasmuch as there are people who consider themselves ill used, unless one tells them everything, straitened through I am for space, I will glance at this transaction. After the desperate charge of young Doones had been met by us, and broken, and just as poor Kit Babcock died in the arms of the dead Charley, I happened to descry a patch of white on the grass of the meadow, like the head of a sheep after washing day. Observing with some curiosity how carefully this white thing moved along the bars of the darkness betwixt the panels of firelight, I ran up to intercept it, before it reached the little postern which we used to call Guinea's door. Perceiving me, the white thing stopped, and was for making back again; but I ran up at full speed, and lo, it was the flowing silvery hair of that sage the counsellor, who was scuttling away upon all fours, but now rose and confronted me. "John," he said, "Sir John, you will not play falsely with your ancient friend. Among these violent fellows, I look to you to protect me, John." "Honoured sir, you are right," I replied; "but surely that posture was unworthy of yourself and your many resources. It is my intention to let you go free." "I knew it. I could have sworn to it. You are a noble fellow, John. I said so, from the very first. You are a noble fellow, and an ornament to any rank. But upon two conditions," I added, gently taking him by the arm; for instead of displaying any desire to commune with my nobility, he was edging away toward the postern. "The first is that you tell me truly, for now it can matter to none of you, who it was that slew my father." "I will tell you truly and frankly, John, however painful to me to confess it. It was my son Carver." "I thought as much, or I felt as much all along," I answered; "but the fault was none of yours, sir, for you were not even present. If I had been there, it would not have happened. I am always opposed to violence; therefore let me haste away. This scene is against my nature." "You shall go directly, Sir Counsellor, after meeting my other condition, which is, that you place in my hands Lady Lorna's diamond necklace." "Ah, how often I have wished," said the old man with a heavy sigh, "that it might yet be in my power to ease my mind in that respect, and to do a thoroughly good deed by lawful restitution." "Then try to have it in your power, sir. Surely, with my encouragement, you might summon resolution." "Alas, John, the resolution has been ready long ago, but the thing is not in my possession. Carver, my son, who slew your father, upon him you will find the necklace. What are jewels to me, young man, at my time of life? Baubles and trash. I detest them. from the sins they have led me to answer for. When you come to my age, good Sir John, you will scorn all jewels, and care only for a pure and bright conscience. Ah, let me go. I have made my peace with God." He looked so hoary, and so silvery, and serene in the moonlight, that verily I must have believed him, if he had not drawn in his breast. But I happen to have noticed that when an honest man gives vent to noble and gentle sentiments, he spreads his breast, and throws it out, as if his heart was swelling; whereas I had seen this old gentleman draw in his breast more than once, as if it happened to contain better goods than sentiment. "Will you applaud me, kind sir," I said, keeping him very tight all the while, "if I place it in your power to ratify your peace with God? The pledge is upon your heart, no doubt, for there it lies at this moment." With these words, and some apology for having recourse to strong measures, I thrust my hand inside his waistcoat, and drew forth Lorna's necklace, purely sparkling in the moonlight, like the dancing of new stars. The old man made a stab at me with a knife which I had not espied, but the vicious onset failed, and then he knelt, and clasped his hands. "Oh, for God's sake, John, my son, rob me not in that manner. They belong to me, and I love them so, I would give almost my life for them. There's one jewel I can look at for hours, and see all the lights of heaven in it, which I never shall see elsewhere. Oh, my wretched, wicked life! Oh, John, I am a sad hypocrite. But give me back my jewels, or else kill me here. I am a babe in your hands, but I must have back my jewels." As his beautiful white hair fell away from his noble forehead, like a silver wreath of glory, and his powerful face, for once, was moved with real emotion, I was so amazed and overcome by the grand contradictions of nature, that verily I was on the point of giving him back the necklace. But honestly, which is said to be the first instinct of all the Ridds, although myself never found it so, happened here to occur to me. And so I said, without more haste than might be expected, "Sir Counsellor, I cannot give you what does not belong to me. But if you will show me that particular diamond which is heaven to you, I will take it upon myself the risk and the folly of cutting it out for you. And with that you must go contented, and I beseech you not to starve with that jewel upon your lips." Seeing no hope of better terms, he showed me his pet love of a jewel, and I thought of what Lorna was to me, as I cut it out, with the hinge of my knife severing the snakes of gold, and placed it in his careful hand. Another moment, and he was gone, and away through Guinea's postern, and God knows what became of him. Now as to Carver, the thing was this: so far as I could ascertain from the valiant miners, no two of whom told the same story, any more than one of them told it twice. The band of Doones which sailed forth for the robbery of the pretended convoy was met by Simon Carfax, according to arrangement, at the ruined house called the Warren, in that part of the Bagworthy forest where the river Exe, as yet a very small stream, runs through it. The Warren, as all our people know, had belonged to a fine old gentleman, whom every one called the Squire, who had retreated from active life to pass the rest of his days in fishing and shooting, and helping his neighbours. For he was a man of some substance, and no poor man ever left the Warren without a bag of good victuals, and a few shillings put in his pocket. However, this poor Squire never made a greater mistake than in hoping to end his life peacefully upon the banks of a trout stream, in the green forest of Bagworthy. For as he came home from the brook at dusk, with his fly rod over his shoulder, the Doones fell upon him and murdered him. and then sacked his house and burned it. Now this had made honest people timid about going past the warren at night, for of course it was said that the old squire walked, upon certain nights of the moon, in and out of the trunks of trees, on the green path from the river. On his shoulder he bore a fishing rod, and his book of trout flies in one hand, and on his back a wicker creel, and now and then he would burst out laughing to think of his coming so near the Doones. And now that one turns to consider it, this seems a strangely righteous thing, that the scene of one of the greatest crimes even by Doones committed should, after 20 years, become the scene of vengeance falling, like hail from heaven upon them. For although the warren lies well away to the westward of the mine, and the gold, under escort to Bristol or London, would have gone in the other direction, Captain Carfax, finding his place best suited for working out his design, had persuaded the Doones that for reasons of government the ore must go first to Barnstaple for inspection, or something of that sort. And as everyone knows that our government sends all things westward, when eastward bound, this had won the more faith for Simon, as being according to nature. Now Simon, having met these flowers of the flock of villainy, where the rising moonlight flowed through the wet work of the wood, begged them to dismount, and led them with air of mystery into the squire's ruined hall, black with fire, and green with weeds. "Captain, I have found a thing," he said to Carver Doone himself, "which may help to pass the hour, ere the lump of gold comes by. The smugglers are a noble race, but a miner's eyes are a match for them. There lies a puncheon of rare spirit, with the Dutchman's brand upon it, hidden behind a broken heath. Set a man outside watch, and let us see what this be like." With one accord they agreed to this, and Carver pledged Master Carfax, and all the Doones grew merry. But Simon, being bound, as he said, to see to their strict sobriety, drew a bucket of water from the well into which they had thrown the dead owner, and begged them to mingle it with their drink, which some of them did, and some refused. But the water from that well was poured, while they were carousing, into the brimming pan of every gun of theirs, even as Simon had promised to do with the guns of the men they were come to kill. Then, just as the giant Carver arose, with a glass of pure Hollands in his hand, and by the light of the torch they had struck, proposed the good health of the squire's ghost, in the broken doorway stood a press of men with pointed muskets, covering every drunken Doone. How it fared upon that I know not, having none to tell me, for each man wroth, neither thought of telling, nor whether he might be alive to tell. The Doones rushed to their guns at once, and pointed at them, but the squire's well had drowned their fire, and then they knew that they were betrayed, but resolved to fight like men for it. Upon fighting I can never dwell, it breeds such savage delight in me, of which I would fain have less. Enough that all the Doones fought bravely, and like men, though bad ones, died in the hall of the man they had murdered. And with them died poor young D. Witcher Hazel, who, in spite of his good father's prayers, had cast in his lot with the robbers. Carver Doone alone escaped, partly through his fearful strength, and his yet more fearful face, but mainly perhaps through his perfect coolness, and his mode of taking things. I am happy to say that no more than 8 of the gallant miners were killed in that combat, or died of their wounds afterwards; and adding to these the 8 we had lost in our assault on the valley, and 2 of them excellent warehousemen, it cost no more than 16 lives to be rid of nearly 40 Doones, each of whom would most likely have killed 3 men in the course of a year or 2. Therefore, as I said at the time, a great work was done very reasonably. Here were nigh upon 40 Doones destroyed, in the valley and up at the Warrens, despite their extraordinary strength, and high skill in gunnery; whereas of us ignorant rustics there were only 16 to be counted dead, though others might be lamed, or so; and of those 16 only 2 had left wives, and their wives did not happen to care for them. Yet for Lorna's sake I was vexed at the bold escape of Carver. Not that I sought for Carver's life any more than I did for the Counsellor's; but that for us it was no light thing, to have a man of such power, and resource, and desperation, left at large, and furious, like a famished wolf round the sheepfold. Yet greatly as I blamed the yeomen, who were posted on their horses, just out of shot from the Doone gate, for the very purpose of intercepting those who escaped the miners, I could not get them to admit that any blame attached to them. But lo, he had dashed through the whole of them, with his horse at full gallop, and was nearly out of shot before they began to think of shooting him. Then it appears from what a boy said, for boys manage to be everywhere, that Captain Carver rode through the Doone gate, and so to the head of the valley. There of course he beheld all the houses, and his own among the number, flaming with a handsome blaze, and throwing a fine light around such as he often had revelled in, when of other people's property. But he swore the deadliest of all oaths, and seeing himself to be vanquished, so far as the luck of the moment went, spurred his great black horse away, and passed into the darkness. End of chapter 72. Recording by Daisy 55.